Hi, everybody. Welcome to tonight's discussion of Parasite. I am very happy to be joined by Paul Wright of Cabrini University. Paul, how are you this evening?
Good. How are you?
I'm well, thanks, and thank you for suggesting that we revisit Parasite. As I was saying earlier, it's a movie I'm very happy I had a quote unquote excuse to see again. And now with the added benefit of your introduction, which I thought shed a lot of light on, in my case, another viewing. So thank you very much for that. And before we get into the content, just a little review about our procedures. Please keep your audio on mute until I call on you with your question or comment. I will know to call on you because you can use the raise hand function within Zoom, at which point I will say your name and you should please unmute yourself and then ask your question or make your comment. I will call on people in the order that they appear to me, and I will try to get to everyone once, and time permitting, if people have second or third comments or questions, I will try to get back to you as well. I would also encourage you to please use the chat function within Zoom. This is a great way to introduce yourself to the group, to start a conversation with others about other topics, and to let us know where you're from if you're from outside the greater Philadelphia area. And if you're from really far outside the greater Philadelphia area, please consider visiting the Where in the World section on brynmarfilm.org within the Film Studies Online portion of our website. As you can see, we have had folks join us from all over the country and all over the world. And if you're one of those folks, drop us a line through the website and let us know how you found us and how we're doing and what's going on where you are, cinematically speaking, in any case. And with that, I think we are probably ready to get started. I see we have one of our regulars first out of the gate. David, how are you tonight?
I am fine. Thanks to Paul. We saw this movie last year, and now I think we could probably, with Paul's introduction, instead of our hour and a half plus tonight, we could easily do 3 or 4 hours. I got a couple of sort of top thoughts. One is the flooding scene. I was so reminiscent in some regards of Les Miserables and the underground, the mano y mano, doing anything when your back is against the wall, and the moralistic issues. Maybe at some point one of you can say, how do you film a flood scene like that? It was amazing to watch the second time. And sort of at the end, I was thinking of Cats in the Cradle and Leader of the Band, the kinds of songs that talk about the difficulties of generation communicating with generation. And I think that was partly because of some of what Paul's opening talked about at the end, when young Kim writes that whole letter to his dad, almost certainly knowing after he's translated it into Morse code that there's really no way to get the message to the senior Mr. Kim. I could probably go on and use up the whole time, but I'd like to let the two of you and then the rest of the group go on. Thank you, Paul. I really loved your opening.
Thanks for that, David. Paul, did you have, dealer's choice? What would you like to respond to first among David's comments?
Well, I would love to hear you talk about the flood scenes and your thoughts about how they were executed. I agree, they were pretty stunning. And it's a set piece that shows up in the middle of a film that has already got you interested in all sorts of other things, and then throws that flood at you and gives you a larger panorama, if you will, of what's really going on in society at large, right? Not just in the house of the Parks. The only thing I'd say perhaps about the ending, and I alluded to this in the intro, I didn't say much more because I wasn't sure who was watching the film for the first time. But now that I assume you've all seen it, the son engages in a bit of wish fulfillment, right? Of fantasy, thinking about the day he might be able to buy the home to release his father. And we even see that visualized as a kind of wish, but it's clearly not happening anytime soon. And I suggested that, and I'm going to say this, it's not a hard and fast rule. I don't really think it's that schematic, but I do think an American audience watches that ending potentially in a different way than a Korean audience, if only in this sense. You probably know that he's never going to manage to buy that house, but I think you're conditioned to hope that some way, somehow, he might. That there's always a hope. So in your mind's eye, you can envision a reunion between father and son. But I think for a Korean audience, maybe for audiences around the world who don't share that kind of optimism about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, something I think even in this country we're questioning right now. He's never going to be able to buy that house. And Bong actually estimated the amount of time it would take for the son to buy the house would be about 500 to 600 years, based on his current income. And that's assuming he has no other expenses to worry about. So it seems pretty impossible that that reunion will happen other than in cinema.
Regarding the flood, I looked a little bit after this most recent viewing for some information on that. I didn't find anything that really sort of gave an in-depth explanation. What I will say is that that's the magic of movies, right? That they're obviously the beginning portions of that sort of sequence when they sort of flee the house and they're going home during this massive rainstorm. Some of those are obviously shot on location, and the very heavy but very consistent and photogenic rain would have been created by massive rain machines. It seems like an almost impossible undertaking, but if you've ever seen these machines, they're surprisingly enormous and powerful. But also, it is amazing what pointing the camera and framing things a certain way can give the impression of, along with the very intelligent use of sound. But at some point, they obviously get close enough to their home, and then it becomes a set. And we have seen all sorts of underwater work done quite convincingly, submerged or partially submerged, whether it was Titanic or the very Guillermo del Toro, the very overrated Romance of a couple of years ago, or pick a Mission Impossible movie. So I know a lot of this movie, far more than we would think from first looking at it, was shot on sets, constructed on sound stages and other facilities like that. So I would bet that the apartment, both before and after the flood or during the flood, was constructed similarly.
The one footnote I'd add is there's a filmmaker I had in mind watching those scenes again this time, who I think would have appreciated this movie in every possible respect, but someone who also loved the use of rain, and that's Akira Kurosawa. And Kurosawa, if you know his films like High and Low and a host of other movies, they were all meditations on class. And I think Kurosawa would have really appreciated this movie, and particularly that flood scene, because if you watch enough Kurosawa films, you will see a lot of rainstorms.
Yeah, even Rashomon, right?
Yeah.
Let's see. Joss, do you have a question or comment?
I certainly do. I saw this movie when it first came out not that long ago and thought it was wonderful, and watched it again in anticipation of this event and was reminded how wonderful it is. I want to thank Paul for his comprehensive introduction to this. He made a reference to Martin Scorsese's relationship with a primary actor, which is clear in this film and our previous discussion of Snowpiercer. And I would also mention another element of Scorsese's filmmaking, which is the use of camera work and this sort of swooping camera, this tracking camera. There were scenes in this film, especially going down the stairways into that sub-basement, that were somewhat reminiscent of the well-known Copa scene from Scorsese's, oh my gosh.
Goodfellas.
Yeah.
There you go, thank you. But more than that, it was the recurring themes. And not that Scorsese used these recurring things, these same recurring themes, but that he does use recurring themes, the sort of amoral banality of violence in the mob. In this film, as Paul mentioned in his introduction, class fable, which also was clearly present in Snowpiercer, and I would broaden that to social fable, which was recently exhibited in Jordan Peele's films, which I know is something that is of interest to Paul. I regret that I have not seen his discussion of that, but I certainly recognize it in terms of racial relationship fable in films like Get Out. Another observation I have was in the midst of all the subterfuge and confidence game activity, the wonderful relationship within the Kim family. And so those are some observations that I've had, and I would certainly hope to hear any observations and comments you have about anything I had to say. And thanks again, Paul, for recommending this film.
Thank you.
I had a thought about the family relationship, if you don't mind. I was both, when I saw this when it first came out and on subsequent viewings, I am as well struck by the bond that seems to exist between the siblings, the bond that seems to exist between the kids and their father. But to me, I feel like the mother is out of it, is apart from the rest of the family, at least in terms of, feeling what I would say appears to be a relatively typical familial bond that it seems to me the other three share. In fact, I remember seeing this for the first time and really initially being confused about who she was, because she didn't seem to me to have that same connection. And then I think as the film goes on, she does seem to be of a different, to me, of a different sort of more detached degree of humanity, of warmth, of sentiment than the other three, who I will grant you are not the most sentimental bunch to begin with. So that's my thought on that. I didn't think it was exactly, I wouldn't call it exactly a close-knit family. But Paul, what are your thoughts?
I think I know what you're getting at regarding the mother. Another way of putting this is I think of her as a kind of stealth character whose importance to that family is not immediately clear. But as time goes on, you do see that she's kind of a glue for them, if only in the sense that she is a realist who often reminds them of things as they really are. She's the one, for example, who says that Mrs. Park is surely nice, but that's only because she's rich enough to afford to be nice. So she's the one with those kinds of insights. There is that great scene right around the middle of the film when they're enjoying the house to themselves because the Parks have gone away. They're going to unexpectedly come home, right? Which leads to all kinds of chaos. But for a while, the house is theirs and they're eating and drinking and enjoying the living room and the vista it affords as a family. And there's this kind of dark moment where the father, played by Song, erupts in anger at the wife and seemingly the whole group. And everyone starts laughing after that. It's not clear to me entirely how much of that was staged all along by the father as an inside joke that they would all be aware of and be able to respond to with the laughter that they eventually do, or how much of it starts out as some genuine rage born out of all this man's frustrations over the years. And that rage is being directed towards, his wife and the people around him. And maybe he's able to pull back from the brink of that and turn it into a joke that they can all laugh about. So I really like how the Kim family is never sentimentalized too much in this film. That would be an easy mistake to make. I think I said this in the intro. It's a reason I don't view this film to be an allegory in the way I do view Snowpiercer to be an allegory. I do prefer the term fable that the commenter just mentioned. I do think we're in a great era right now of social fables. Jordan Peele is certainly a great touchstone for that. And those kinds of class fables are not easy to do well. When they're done poorly, they're the worst possible kinds of films, and they turn me off enormously. But somehow this film manages to handle all this really elegantly.
Yeah, and I think it's really that absence of sentimentality really in the part of both families, right? And that the sort of the clarity, you might expect a sort of pragmatic clarity from, perhaps one family, but to have it, guide the vision of most members of both families, I think sort of separates the film. But to me, it's kind of like why I think so much of Michael Mann's movie Heat. You have a number of movies that do a good job giving you insight into criminals. You have some that do a good job giving you insight into cops. That movie does both. This movie, I feel like, it would be so easy to give us sort of that entry to the workings of one family or the other, one side of the divide or the other. But he's really interested, the whole film is interested in giving us insight into both. And it does so without the didacticism that too often plague either the determination to do that sort of characterization or the determination to make some sort of critical points about class and the structure of society. Kathleen, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, hi. Thank you for suggesting this film. I had seen it last year and I watched it again this time, and I got a lot more from it this time. And thank you for your introduction, Paul. I have a specific question about the party scene. As you remember, that was very gory and there was a lot of knives and swords being flashed around. I wonder why the filmmaker feels the need to use that level of gore in his movie, and what I can really get from that, so that I'm trying to understand what he's really trying to say there.
Okay. Paul, did you have any thoughts on that?
I want to think for a minute about the violence, because I think that's at the heart of the question here, the gore in particular. And as I said in the intro, this is a movie that deftly, for me at least, moves between lots of different genres and tones. And that includes elements of outright horror. And we certainly see that at the end. Now, why that has to be, why other choices couldn't have been made, that's worth talking about, I guess. The one thing about the party, though, that I've read about and that I found kind of intriguing is the iconography of the party, which, based on the young Park boy's interests in cowboys and Indians, and particularly Indians, Native Americans, he fixates on the clothing, the dress, the tomahawks, the whole 9 yards, almost in the way that a kid of the 50s or 60s might have. I don't know about today, but here in the States, cowboys and Indians loomed large in our cultural imagination. And so it seems they loom large in this kid's imagination. And I read an interview somewhere with Bong saying that he was very conscious in choosing that and giving a kind of colonial undertone to the whole proceeding, and using that in a way to comment on the predatory nature of class relations in Korea as he knew it and knows it today. So there are interesting little touches in the party that are meant to, in a way, clue you into the violence that's about to happen. You know, it isn't just kids running around in a backyard. There's something really ugly brewing here. The fact that it's so gory, though, would not be surprising in a context of South Korean film. There are plenty of gory South Korean films, but it may or may not work for you as a viewer, and I totally appreciate that. Andrew, I don't know if you have thoughts there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of times people talk about, critics, filmmakers, whoever, talk about violence or the depiction of violent acts or the sight of blood in a movie, and they talk about sort of wanting to shock the audience. And I don't think this is intended so much to shock the audience as it is to shock the people within the film, that in their darkest, nightmares and their worst conceivable version of how their lives will unfold or the things that will happen to them, this sort of violence is not on the menu. And I think that I think it's shocking because it is violent and it is bloody, but I also think it is shocking because it is so horribly inappropriate, right? Inappropriate in the sort of sense of decorum, of behavior, of propriety, of all those things. The other thing I would say is that this movie is building to something, right? And there is tension, and there are moments of little releases of tension, but the ratchet only goes so far before it catches again and starts clicking back up, right? And there was bound to be some sort of explosion, and I don't just simply mean that from a sort of, the view of kind of narrative satisfaction or story construction or genre or anything like that, but to really make the statement about the dynamic depicted in the movie, that this is an unsustainable dynamic, that this stratification and the inability to bridge it is an unacceptable or intolerable way for the society to be. There has to be something within the movie to give us that sense visually and viscerally, other than the sort of more abstract notions of injustice and poverty and things like that. And just in a way, I think of something like the Odessa step sequence in Battleship Potemkin. There is a rhetorical power to eruptions of violence, and I really think that's why my guess would be the filmmakers would say it was essential to include.
I think, to Andrew's point, I love the connection to Eisenstein, Potemkin, and the Odessa Steps. The contrast I might draw there is in Potemkin, that's state-sponsored and authorized violence of a sort that becomes grimly predictable and inevitable, as those scenes develop in that great movie. In this film, you really never interact much with state authority, except here and there at the bitter end, of course, when everything happens. But we don't get any crazy, violent, shootouts or knife fighting with the police, right? We get it amongst ordinary people. And that's what makes it even more shocking in a sense than what you see in Potemkin, because this violence that Andrew described, so well as brewing the whole time, it erupts in a totally chaotic way. There are no clear battle lines here, like on a battlefield. It's every person for themselves at this point. And the carnage and the casualties are all the more heartbreaking when you think about the fact that these are not soldiers, these are not police, these are not Scorsese, world gang members. These are ordinary folks, most of them basically decent people who turn very indecent.
Well, and I also think it's interesting, and it's worth noting that all of the violence is initiated. It's not ultimately only perpetrated by, but the first sort of strike of violence is by the man who'd been living in the basement, who we would say is much more of the class of the family that the family of the workers, but also feels tremendous appreciation for, fondness for, and as he keeps saying, respect for the family that owns the house. And so I think it's interesting that the violence starts because we can imagine that however that party was going to go, it wasn't going to erupt into violence until that variable entered into things, right? That the father, who was the driver, may have felt deeply offended and been put on edge by the comments about his smell and his wife's smell, but it probably wasn't going to devolve into a physical attack until that started by this real sort of wild card whose actions were set in motion, days earlier by a series of events that led to that when that family tumbled down that last set of stairs. So I think that I think it's important that the violence is started by this character who sort of bridges, in a way, kind of occupies a space between the two main families. I can't quite put my finger on why that matters, but I feel like it does. Marge, you have a question or comment?
Okay, got it. Hi, can you hear me?
Hi. Yes, we can.
Hi, it's so wonderful to see you both.
You too.
You too.
Okay, I'm so sorry I missed the intro, so this may be a duplication. One of the things that I think is so striking about this film each time I see it is the way the director uses architecture as a metaphor for the class system, that it begins, with that awful apartment that the Kim family is living in. It expands to the stunning space that the Parks live in, and it continues on the flight of the Kims back to their own quarters, which is like watching a descent into hell. Mm-hmm. That's something that I every time I watch it, I'm just I marvel at it. I wondered if you had talked about that before, earlier in the introduction.
I had talked about that at the beginning of the intro. I think the intro is still available, right, Andrew? There's a way to access it. Okay.
I will definitely look.
Awesome. You're spot on. Certainly, as far as I view the film, I think verticality, the way the vertical dimension of vision is used in the film, is really extraordinary, which is pretty amazing for a film done in otherwise widescreen, where you can take advantage of horizontal vistas very well. And there are some beautiful horizontal vistas in this film. One of them's right behind me, right? The Park House.
Yes.
But the use of vertical space, to me, is the more interesting thing in the movie. I think it's exactly what you were getting at. and
staircase.
and the staircases. And
Oh.
one thing I also said was the claustrophobia we feel in the Kim's home
Yes.
replicates in the Parks home. So while it's a spacious home, it feels in its own way just as confining to everyone in it. And that's an amazing effect to achieve when the space you're working in is otherwise the envy of anybody, right?
It's extraordinary. It's really extraordinary. I think I had a question for you, which now has slipped away. but
That's okay.
That, you know, I'm so excited to see you.
You too, Marge. Been too long.
There's also a long tradition in movies that are concerned with, even if they're not primarily about class difference and class struggle. There's a long tradition of using that difference in elevation, in height, and the gap between them to help emphasize that point visually. After all, we're talking about films. We want, if the points can't be made visually, we at least want them reinforced that way. And Paul, you may have mentioned, I can't remember if you did in your intro, you may have mentioned Metropolis.
That's a big one, yeah.
Right, which is a prime example of that, very much. Another movie,
Kurosawa's High and Low, which I mentioned earlier. Also,
there you go.
Verticality, yeah.
Many of the, I'm drawing a blank, but there's the Robert Altman directed British comedy about a comedy set in Britain about the servants in a house and the more well-to-do. I've never watched Downton Abbey myself. I would imagine there's a difference made between the servants' quarters and places and other places in the home. A movie like Blade Runner, which was deeply influenced by Metropolis, even something like The Magnificent Ambersons, and how their house is not only up on this hill, but it's this very vertical house in a time when many weren't to that degree. So it's a time-honored technique and a one that makes a perfect sense. But I will say that I think it's done in this film more sort of organically than in a lot of others. And also, as Paul was saying, it almost kind of, in a way, sneaks up on you, right? That things aren't initially sort of set up with such a high-low dichotomy, but over time and sort of as the film goes on and we get a better sense of the space, the individual spaces, but also the spaces between those two, we get to know better. It becomes more evident, and that's, I think, one of the. I mean, I love that we don't see the sort of we don't really get a good look at the journey between the Kim's home and the Parks home until we're more than halfway through the movie, and then we sort of get to revel in it as they are this sort of struggling to make their way home in this storm. So a very, very canny use of that, I think.
You get the initial.
Susan pointed out that the Altman film is Gosford Park.
Thank you, Gosford Park. Thank you.
Yes. There's that initial when Kevin is approaching the house for his initial interview for the job, in which he's sort of overwhelmed by the scale of all the walls that are wrapping around those wealthy people's houses. Thought that was, and he's kind of in a canyon, which is really interesting. It sort of introduces that whole idea.
It does. Thank you, Marge.
Thank you.
Dana, you had a question or comment.
Hi, guys. First of all, I'm so glad you chose this movie, as I wrote when I registered. I've been wanting to talk or more than to hear about this movie for a year. It just cries out to be discussed. And this is a great one tonight. So I just have a couple of things, and nothing particularly profound, but one of the things, Paul, that you mentioned in your introduction, which I completely agreed with and loved thinking about when I watched it this time, was all of the genres. We talk about genres so often when we talk about these films, and there are so many of them, including almost comedic things in this movie that, and for me, they just all work so well. I mean, it's amazing how they seamlessly seem to go together. And I was sort of trying to figure out why I thought that might be. And I don't know, of course, but I'm no kind of filmmaker. But one of the things, and we talked about this a little bit before, is there are three families, right? It's not just the Kim family and the Park family. There's the other family, the ones in the bowels of the house. And one of the interesting things that I sort of picked up is that there's no family dysfunction of any kind. All three of these families operate in their own worlds, but they all really get along. I mean, they're very loving people in a very kind of Asian filmy sensibility, which we don't often see in American movies, or often it's not part of what American movies are. And I was wondering if that might have something to do with while so many different genres can work, because there's something so stable, and that is family. There was that. And the other comment I want to make, which isn't, again, that to me, the whole business of smell and that horrifying scene when the Kims are under the table and they're being criticized for the way they smell. I mean, I could almost smell. And the fact is, movies give us so much to see and so much to hear, but the other three senses, we don't get touch, we don't get taste, we don't get smell. I almost felt like we got a sense of smell in this movie, and it was just so demeaning for those people and so powerful. So again, there's so many amazing things about this movie, and the discussion is bringing a lot of them out. But I just wanted to mention a couple. So thanks so much for picking this one.
Love your comments as always. You know, this film, to your point about all the senses being engaged, not every movie will do that, right? And it proves you don't need a gimmick like smell-o-vision to make, you know, your audience engaged on every sensory level. I do think there's something really visceral about this movie. Despite the stately setting of most of it, it's a very body-driven, visceral kind of experience for me to watch, at least. And to your point about families and genres, I think you're onto something there. I would just go back to what I said in the intro, that this film doesn't offer up any easy heroes or villains, and no member of any of the three families, and you're right, there are really three here, no member of any of those families is schematic enough to reduce to a trope. And I appreciate that. I think if that happens, the movie falls apart. Even if it's just one or two characters that become caricatures, the movie falls apart. And I fear that in other hands around the world, not just in South Korea, this film could have been very ham-fisted and not so beautifully and elegantly executed. And I agree with you, if you don't get those characterizations right, and part of that is rooted in the nature of family, if you don't get that right, then all the genre bending probably doesn't work either. All of a sudden it becomes very showy and very distracting, you know, whereas I don't find it that way in this film. And that's another tough act to pull off. And Bong somehow does.
I mean, all of us know, and perhaps it's been brought into stark relief by the last year, but all of us know that life contains elements of all genres. At least most of them, perhaps not animation, which isn't really a genre. It's a mode of storytelling, but that's neither here nor there. But life contains highs and lows, and comedy and drama and suspense and horror, unfortunately, and all of those things. And I think relating to what Dana was saying about the creation of the stable family, it created a credible sense of place and a credible sense of a real world being occupied by real people, despite all of the, you know, fable-like, if not allegorical, things that happen. And once you've created that sense of credibility with characters that aren't just characters but are people, then you can more credibly have the things that happen to all people happen to them, with more acceptance from the audience. Regarding smell, I completely agree. And I think part of the reason, at least, is that so few movies draw attention to the sense of smell in any way. And this movie brings it up this movie brings up smell and taste more so than most movies do. And with the exception of movies that are sort of expressly about food or cooking or things like that, I think it has very vivid mentions of and depictions of or presentations of food as well. And I think that the movie is very interested in creating that sense of place and space so much that it embraces those other senses to the extent it can. And if we also think about how much smells and tastes are two things that do vary with living conditions and lifestyles and things like that, it makes sense, or have the potential to anyway, it makes sense that this movie would be so interested in evoking those senses. But I think part of the reason that we're almost able to experience them is because the movie tries, it makes an effort, where so many other movies don't bother to or aren't interested in doing so.
Good example of what Andrew's talking about here is the sequence when the Parks come home and the Kims have to scramble and hide, and they're told, the mother is told, right, to put on the stove some ramdon. And I was reading about this. There's some articles on this, many of which were written in South Korea. Some of them got translated, so I was able to read them. The ramdon in the movie is basically an invention of the movie. It's kind of a hybrid of a few things that Koreans do eat, so it's not total fabrication, but it's a new take on some existing foods. And the fact that the Park mother demands this to be made with steak, it ends up taking something that is kind of an ordinary, late night snack made in a hurry for exactly this purpose. And it makes it even more elevated as a kind of class status symbol. So even their ramen can't be ordinary ramen. And it's just a small example of what Andrew's talking about, that attention to detail, that willingness to let you as the viewer breathe and take in the air at the Park home and imagine the foods being cooked and the smells there, as well as the smells, in the tenement where the Kims live. So all those things are engaged in a way that I agree with Andrew, you normally don't see in a film.
Arlene, you have a question or comment?
Yes, I watched an interview with Bon Joon-ho, and he talked about being influenced by Alfred Hitchcock, particularly the scene in Psycho that was filmed from above on the stairway, and talked about all the scenes where later in the film, where in his film, where the stairs all came into it and the levels came into it. And the other thing that I had a personal question about was, why would the family who were watching someone's house feel that they had to let someone in who said they wanted to come in for something?
Well, I think I would defer to Andrew on Hitchcock for sure, but your question about why do they let her in, I think the fear is that they have some other way of getting in touch with the Parks if they won't engage, right, and let them in, and that would just create more questions and problems down the road. That's the only explanation I can come up with. Andrew, thoughts on the Hitchcock connection?
Yeah, I mean, it's rare that a feature filmmaker from any country hasn't seen Hitchcock films and gleaned some useful techniques from it. I mean, one of the major sort of elements of Hitchcock that I always talk about, and I think is so essential to understanding the appeal of him as a filmmaker, is his interest in sort of the terror of everyday places and everyday things. And this is a movie that, I mean, the last place you think a bloodbath like that is going to occur is at an impromptu backyard birthday party for, a 7-year-old kid. I mean, this movie is filled with situations or people that might be passingly or vaguely familiar to some of us on one side of the ledger or the other, but that take turns that none of us ever thinks about, much the way we've all driven by birds sitting on a telephone wire and never gave them a second thought. So it wouldn't surprise me that he wanted to glean some techniques and some viewpoints from Hitchcock for this film. I think it's very fitting in some ways.
Thank you.
Sure. I also wanted to mention that we got a question, sort of a continuity question about how the Kims showed up in the chat, how the Kims showed up on the day of the party in clean clothes when all their stuff was damaged in the flood. And the answer was that there's a shot of them in the shelter where they slept the next morning, going through piles of clothes that had presumably been donated for people who had been affected by that flood. So that was how they were able to do that. We don't seem to have any other questions or comments, which I find oh, there we go.
David has one on the Academy Awards there. Do you see it?
Let me see.
Next to last comment.
Oh, yes. I thought it was I thought it was great. I mean, it was bound to happen, right? That there would be a film that came along that either through its combination of storytelling, use of technique, and topic would cross, quote unquote, boundaries that hadn't really been crossed before. And, Bong Joon-ho had been sort of building his, that makes it sound like he's doing it intentionally and it's a mercenary. His profile had been building in the United States for some time. Mm-hmm. And you couple that with all of the concerns about, gaps in wealth and inequality that had been getting increasing coverage in the news and increasing discussion in some sectors of government. I think it was really sort of a kind of critical mass that was reached. I also think it probably is also emblematic of shifts, something of a shift of how people watch movies. And I was very glad to see that sort of it suggests more of an openness to subtitles, films not in English, and the result, the necessary subtitles that go with it than had historically been the case. But I think because of what streaming has become, I think people are increasingly exposed to programs and films from other countries and have to make less effort to seek them out. And so I think it's sort of benefited from that rising tide as well.
I would just add, well, first on a kind of humorous note, I watch everything with subtitles anymore, maybe because I'm getting older, but also simply because I have a very readerly sensibility, even when it comes to films. I like reading text, so there's something for me that was never a problem about subtitles, but I think Andrew's right. It took a long time for the viewing public to kind of come around to that. One of the questions built into David's question here is, were you surprised? I don't think I was surprised by the point of the ceremony, if only because all the professional prognosticators were saying it was Parasite's award to lose. I think I would have been surprised and disappointed if it did lose. What I think is important, though, is for the film that broke the barrier in this way to also be a truly great film, one of the best films of the young 21st century. I think that's important. I didn't want it to be a film that would 5 years later be the kind of film you asked, oh, why did that ever win? I didn't want it to suffer the fate of Crash, which is by no means as bad a film as it's remembered, but it certainly wasn't the best picture that year. And even its director, Paul Haggis, will tell you that. He's very frank in saying it. So there's nothing to feel bad about going down the road in terms of the legacy of this movie, both in terms of what it accomplished by breaking barriers, but more importantly, the fact that it's just an outright great film. And I also think for me as personally, as a student of Asian cinema and someone who lived in Japan for 4 years, I really was rooting for this film in a way maybe that I wouldn't have just any other film. And for me, I think it was a watershed moment in all kinds of ways. And I mean, I was cheering out loud when the film won, because I really felt it deserved it.
The other thing I'll say is that I think that while this is by no means a slow moving movie in terms of in terms of shot length or the frequency of edits, it's not a particularly fast one either. And I think much of what the filmmakers accomplished visually is, not all of it, but much of it is accomplished through composition, careful, intentional composition on those sets that were constructed for the purposes of telling this story, more so than through the editing. And I think that when that time is taken, it not only allows a broader range of moviegoers to both absorb what's being told to them, but also become absorbed. It also, for my personal view, one of the reasons I find subtitles challenging is I have to read the text because I don't speak the language. And then I'm also trying to look at shot composition, because I believe that the film is using that to communicate with me as well. And I often don't have time to do both to the sufficient degree for my viewing. This movie makes it much easier to do both. I have time to read the I think very efficient dialogue, and then still look at the shot that's being held, because so much thought was put into how the shot was going to be composed and how the blocking was done in the set that was designed for this purpose. So I think that helps as well.
To Andrew's point here, I'm teaching a class right now with my Cabrini students, my honor students, on television as narrative art. So we're looking at the last 25 years of great television. And one of the things that the students have been learning is that a great TV show, and I would say a great movie as well, is very intentional and very smart in teaching you how to watch it, in giving you conditions for perception and understanding of what you're about to see. And I think Andrew's getting at that in the way that this film uses visual language so powerfully that the subtitle part of the exercise is not a chore. It's actually a pleasure. And so you're not distracted the way you might be in another film, perhaps unfairly, in a case of a foreign film that if you knew the language, you wouldn't have those issues at all. But for whatever reason, this is a film that has worked really well abroad. And I think that is part of the reason for its ultimate success at the Oscars. Last little point on the Oscars, my pet peeve about them is that they cast themselves as the World Series, the global championship. And just like in baseball, the World Series does have players from all over the world for sure. But it is fundamentally an American event. And I would love to see sports of all kinds be more truly global. And I would say the same of filmmaking. We need to have a more global vision if the Oscars are going to really mean anything going into not just this century, but the century after it. And I think this is a good step in the right direction.
Janet, you have a question or comment?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, just so the conversation doesn't end quite yet, thanks so much. Yeah, I have a few observations that we all saw, I'm sure. And if I mention them, maybe you would, riff off of them somehow if you want. But there were a couple of instances when the lower classes had the opportunity to help each other, but they didn't. One was when the families were negotiating in the basement, and the other was when they're on the flooded set, and one fellow asks for help, but they have to take care of their own family. And then there was the shot where Mrs. Park is in her closet reaching for her elegant clothes. It cuts right away to the reaching for the clothes in the flood shelter. And then at the party, it opens with the axe hitting into the tree stump, suggesting more to come maybe. And then I liked how the strength of the mother was reinforced. She couldn't have fought off that attacker with the knife if she didn't have those upper arm skills, And then finally, two things. Jessica, we'll call her that, wanted to negotiate with the family in the basement, and yet she's the target of crazy man from the basement with the knife. And she had just said, can't we work something out, to her mother? And then are you at all reminded that the TP and the Indian stuff, American natives, reminded me of Wes Anderson? Do you see anything that reminds Wes Anderson, maybe just in the little stylization of the children's lives? Thank you.
Yeah, it wouldn't shock me if Bong had watched his share of Wes Anderson as well and was being a little playful with that. Of course, he's going to take this movie in a far darker direction than just about any Wes Anderson movie. And as I was saying earlier, the iconography of the teepee and all the rest is a hint of the brutality just underneath the surface of what is otherwise an idyllic looking society, or at least this home looks idyllic. So I think you're onto something there. And what you said at the beginning, I think I talked a little about in the intro, the way in which people who are in misery become predators of one another. And instead of finding solidarity with one another, get into a desperate race for what little privilege they can seize from the moment. And that's exactly what's going on in that panic room in the basement between the Kims and the family that really was there first, right? Andrew?
Yeah, and I think the point about the sort of the wood chopping, perhaps being a bit of foreshadowing for something violent about to occur. I think that, coupled with the all the talk between Mr. Park and Mr. Kim about the sort of staged faux humorous raid and all that, the idea that they were treating as a sort of light-hearted laughing matter, something that was very serious and was and that's what sort of the whole thing was. And this isn't the mother, the film makes the point of the mother saying, I bought that tent from the US. So they're not uniquely guilty, and they're not even the first direct level of the commodification of those people in that history and the violence that often was a part of it. So I think that's really interesting, and I think that there is some, I think Anderson is going for a bit more quaintness, but the sort of Americana elements that sort of prop object toy suggests, I think that's the sort of the common element there, that it's a way to convey that. I could almost imagine, something like in the Coen Brothers, A Serious Man, if that family wasn't so neurotic, that maybe the father and his kids would have worn those headdresses to play around. It's something very much of that particular era and class moment, I think. Steve, you had a question or comment.
Yeah, Andrew, I feel somewhat vindicated actually now, because I've been discussing Korean movies and Korean dramas for the last 10 years with you, and they seem to be finally recognized. Netflix has spent about $500 million to create dramas coming out of Korea. I'm wondering if you or Paul have some sense of what's so unique about the stories that are written there that differ so much about what we're seeing in the United States, that make make viewing their art form so addictive. As you know, many of the people in Asia, once they start watching a Korean drama, they can go 16 episodes. Once they get caught up in it, they must get to the 16th episode or 24th episode. So they're very different than what's happening in the US. And this is an example of something that's captured the imagination of people that are not familiar with Korean dramas or with Korean movies. And I've seen this for years. So I'm wondering, Paul, if you have exposed yourself at all to some of these subtitled movies which I've been watching for years, and why they're so unique and different than what we're creating in the United States. And just as a quick aside, a more recent Korean drama which was created in 2020, actually not only has English subtitles, but much to my dismay, they're actually dubbing it in English. So you can set the audio so you're not listening to Korean, which is a shame because it's actually not a difficult language to listen to in the background. With English subtitles, you can actually hear it in English now, dubbed in English, which I thought was a little surprising and maybe somewhat disappointing. So I'm just curious. You can look up Korean dramas in Wikipedia. You can see how they've been addictive and to the Asian population, and of course some others in the U.S. too. And we have now a large Asian population, so that's also contributed to as well. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are. And see, I told you, Andrew, I've been telling you for years, it's time to have a 2 or 3 nights on what makes Korean drama so fascinating.
So I think with the great group of cinephiles we have in this room and that we always have in person at BMFI, I think folks get why dubbing is a monstrosity that I can't get behind. I'll read as many subtitles as I need to, but I need to hear the original language, even if it's a language I don't know at all. So it's a shame to hear that happening. On the other hand, you pointed out a number of positive developments, namely Netflix putting its money behind Korean filmmaking, Korean television drama, a host of other things. And I think that's where I'll end up getting more of my exposure to the things you know so well already. I think I know films fairly well from Korea, but I don't know a Korean television or Korean serial drama the way I might want to. And I have a feeling Netflix may change that for me. And you're right to point out that these shows are popular well beyond Korea. They are a sensation throughout Asia. And now I suspect they're going to become popular in Europe and the United States, much as K-pop has become popular in Europe and the United States. So yeah, I'm happy to see the coming out party here for Korean filmmaking that has been long overdue.
Paul, got a question in the chat, and I think you mentioned this in your introduction about the film being re-released, at least in a limited basis, in a black and white version. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on, why that was done for this movie, and when that's a pretty rare practice.
Yeah, it's a rare practice. You are seeing it happen a bit more, at least on home video, sometimes even in the theater, with certain films that have a kind of international hold. One example here before Parasite is George Miller has a black and white version of Fury Road, Mad Max Fury Road, that you can watch as a silent film even. So there's this, I think, desire on the part of certain filmmakers to connect their movies to much older traditions and visual styles. And Bong definitely wanted to show a version of his film in a way that would make it feel like a product of the 40s or 50s and not just of this moment, which may be another way of arguing for the universality of the film's themes, the timelessness of the film's themes. It's a wonderful version of the film. I highly recommend it. It definitely creates a different mood and vibe altogether. It does feel very old school, but in a way that I appreciated. I didn't think of it as just a goofy stunt to put on the Blu-ray, of the film. It's more substantive than that.
Joss, you had another question or comment.
Yes, there were several incursions of American culture in this film. The American Indian, the Native American references are one obvious one, but there were others. There was every once in a while, the mother in the Park family would slip into a colloquial English, colloquial American phrase in the midst of whatever she was talking about. I mean, other characters as well, but hers in particular. And then another incursion was at the end of the movie after the massacre, and they were talking about Miranda rights, which just took me aback. And I just wonder if there are any comments about the incursion of America, and I don't know anything about this, but the incursion of American culture into Korean culture.
So my frame of reference personally is more Japan than Korea, because I lived in Japan for 4 years. However, I visited Korea, and I've even been to Daegu, which is a part of Korea that Bong comes from. So I had a chance to visit a university there on a business trip. I will say that what I know of Korea is very similar to Japan in this regard. The infiltration of American culture, iconography, words, is a very old story. There's nothing new in any of that. And of course, the American military presence there, the Korean War, a host of other things probably helped to explain that. But what Andrew was getting at a bit earlier about the commodification of certain elements of American culture and history, or at least a simplistic version of American culture and history, that is a device chosen thematically by the film, by Bong, but it's also reflective of things you will actually see in places like Japan, Korea, and China, where the immigration of language, the immigration of concepts, the immigration of food trends, the immigration of movies, right, looms large in the way people live their everyday lives. And so the sprinkling of English in the film was not at all surprising to me as someone who'd lived abroad in Asia for as long as I did. It's not something the movie invented. On the issue of Miranda rights, I'm not quite sure if they actually say the English word Miranda rights or use the Korean equivalent. I can't remember. I don't know what the legal equivalent would be between the two countries, but yeah, it is a moment that stands out for an American viewer. I could see why.
Paul, we've gotten a question a couple times about the points of comparison perhaps between this film and another one, which I have to admit I didn't see, Shoplifters from a few years back. I don't know if you ever saw that movie.
I've seen part of it on television or on a streamer somewhere. I haven't seen enough of it to really to comment in depth, but the premise, I can see where you're seeing an echo of premise between the two films. This idea of assuming someone else's identity, mentoring other people into a certain kind of criminality. That's a theme you see in a lot of films all over the world, but I think particularly Asian cinema is kind of fascinated with this idea of the chameleon, the person who can bridge different worlds. And Andrew pointed out, right, that the husband in the basement of the Park home is, you know, the person literally being asked to live between two worlds. That's handled, of course, a lot more suggestively than literally with the characters in the rest of the film, or even in something like Shoplifters. But I think those themes are there to be mined. They're not new. There are many things that are not, strictly speaking, new in Parasite. It's how Bong puts them all together, which is usually the hallmark of a great director, right? Someone who can take existing concerns and trends and themes and visual choices and marry them into something that's more than the sum of its parts. Andrew, do you have anything you wanted to add?
No, the only thing I would say is I think, you know, part of why Parasite enjoyed a broader, certainly commercially a warmer reception in the US than perhaps some other films is in part because of what Paul was just saying, that, you know, it's how a story is told. I part of it, I think, probably has to do with Bong's sort of growing reputation and his notoriety in more segments of the American sort of movie viewing public. But I think part of it has to do with, one's sort of savviness as a storyteller. I mean, the sort of, one could imagine, that at some point Bong being subjected to the same sort of knocks that Kurosawa was subjected to earlier in his career, that he's sort of too Western in his filmmaking style. But first of all, I don't know that necessarily would even be levied as a criticism in today's world, which is far more interconnected than it was in the 1950s. But the other thing I would say is that filmmakers want their films to be seen. They tell stories that they think are worth telling, and in most cases are important for people to hear and see. And I think, I've said this before about lots of other things. I think you get more flies with honey than you do with vinegar, and particularly a movie like this, which is important and deals with very relevant issues. The more people you can get to see it, the better it is. Arlene, you have another question or comment.
Yes, I stumbled upon the Directors Guild Awards nominees for 2020, and they were on YouTube, and Bong Joon-ho and 4 other directors were interviewed there. Very, very interesting, and it looks like a great source of getting familiar with more directors, many of which I've heard before. And the other thing I wanted to mention, in 1935 and remade in 1951, was an American film called Kind Lady, where a home was infiltrated by an artist and his wife and a group of friends, where they took over this woman's home and life and assets. So you might want to look into that also. Thank you.
Well, thank you for those suggestions, Arlene. I knew that the Directors Guild, and indeed many of the guilds that are, comprised of working members of the primarily American, but certainly not exclusively American film industry, such as the American Society of Cinematographers and the Screen Actors Guild. A lot of these, and for that matter, even the Academy, have wonderful resources for people who are interested in filmmaking in general or film history, and in many cases, particularly related to awards season, information on individual films. I was not aware of that movie from the 30s that you had mentioned. Paul, had you come across that before?
No, but it's proof, right, that Americans
and
are interested in these kinds of stories too.
It was remade in 1951 with Ethel Barrymore. The original one had Basil Rathbone in it, and the plot was very similar in both of them.
Well, thank you very much, Arlene. That's very interesting. I'm going to see if I can find that.
Another film that comes to mind that's more recent in that vein is something like The Talented Mr. Ripley, where you're infiltrating someone else's life and there's a class edge to your reason for doing so, which plays out in Patricia Highsmith's novels as well as that film adaptation. So definitely we have our examples of these stories too.
Right, and Alfred Hitchcock's Strangers on a Train, which was also based on a Patricia Highsmith novel. So now we've come full circle. And on that note of the bridging of cinema and literature, I think we'll draw tonight's discussion to an end. Thank you all so much for joining us. Paul, thank you for suggesting another great film and introducing it so well, and joining us tonight to talk about it.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you to everyone.
We had a great discussion in large part because of the wonderful comments and questions we got from those of you joining us. You can see we have some more of our Tuesday night seminars coming up down the line, including one in early April taught by Paul. We will have some more to announce before too long, but keep your eye out for these. And of course, We have a lot more film-related information and fun on our website. Go to the Film Studies Online section of brynmarfilm.org, and you can find the Ask Andrew mini lessons. You can find all of the introductions to all of these films we've discussed. You can find links to recordings of all of the discussions if there was one that you missed. And please check out Theater 5 as well, where we have new movies that are only available virtually through cinemas like ours. And if you want to find out what we're going to be discussing the coming Monday, please sign up for our emails. Every Thursday, we send out our education email. That includes a link to the introduction, a link to a list of where you can find that film to stream, and most importantly, what the movie is that will be discussed the following Monday. So visit brynmarfilm.org to sign up for our emails. And we are working very hard to get ready for reopening. It really is going to happen very soon. I can say that much, I think, pretty safely. But until we are able to open those doors, or until you all are comfortable to join us all at the movies and at the theater as you used to, please consider supporting us through some other means. We're very gratified that you're members. We love that you join us for these discussions. But if you have the ability to perhaps make an additional show of support, we would very much appreciate it. It allows us to keep offering these programs for free. And we really appreciate it, and we appreciate the sense of community that we are all a part of, and we look forward to continuing to foster that the best we can. So until next time, thank you all so much for joining us. Have a good week, and look forward to our next discussion. Take care, everybody.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.